Hello, so we're going to continue our conversation of multicultural education, and in this presentation we're going to review three different things that kind of all speak to each other, and one is school reform, which we've talked about a little bit already, family involvement and communication related to multicultural education, and then the assessment related to multicultural education and diversity. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about school reform and give you some background, especially related to curriculum. So we've already talked about the multicultural curriculum, and we've already talked a little bit about what curriculum is, but let me talk specifically to you about the curriculum in Georgia. So as we've discussed before, curriculum is what is taught in schools. So the content, the history, the English, the math, the science, and particularly what specific topics, what specific skills are taught and when they are taught. So curriculum answers the question of, what parts of history are covered and what math skills are taught and when. Do we teach algebra in ninth grade? Do we teach geometry in 10th grade? When do we teach students how to multiply? When do we teach students how to add two-digit numbers? That kind of thing. What works of literature are read? So when do we read this? When do we learn how to write this? And then what skills for learning to read are taught? So more for the younger grades. So when do we teach phonics? When do we teach spelling? All of those different things are parts of the curriculum. So the current curriculum that we use here in Georgia is called Common Core State Standards, or CCSS. Here, particularly in Georgia, you'll hear them called Common Core Georgia Performance Standards, or CCGPS. They've recently been renamed or rebranded as Georgia Standards of Excellence, or GSE. So if you hear any of those, they're really talking about the curriculum and state standards that we use. And these are a set of standards that are divided per subject area that the teachers must use when they build their lessons. So they don't have an option in choosing what they're going to teach or how they're going to teach it. I'm sorry, they do have a choice of how they're going to teach it, but they don't have a choice of what they actually teach. That is set curriculum for them. So again, the curriculum is what is taught. What the teacher does have some influence in is how they teach that content. So what instructional activities they use, how they go about teaching. Do they use technology? Do they use group work? Do they use videos versus a textbook? That type of thing. So the building of their lesson plans and how they teach, they have control over, but what they teach, the curriculum is set. So having a little bit of that background, I'll tell you just kind of as an FYI how to go about and find those standards. So if you go to the Georgia Standards website, which is georgiastandards.org, you can go to, if you choose the Georgia Standards of Excellence tab, you'll see over on the far left-hand side a yellow column that you'll be able to pick your subject area. So English, math, science, social studies, any of those. And then on the far right side, you can choose the blue column for that particular set of standards. If you're looking for upper grade levels, especially high school, you may want to pick it per topic area, so like algebra, geometry, that kind of thing. So that's where you go to find the standards. When you open the PDF of the standards per grade level, this is what they'll kind of look like. This is one for history. You'll notice that each standard asks the students to do something, to take some type of action. So here it's asking them to read and describe, so it's asking them to be able to do something. Also, as you'll see, a lot of these standards are broken down into sub-pieces. So in bold is the main standard, and then there are sub-standards that are A, B, C, D that help to define specifically what the student should be able to do. So who created these standards? A lot of these particular standards were created by a partnership with private industry and consultants. Some of these have a background in education and some of these don't. What's a little bit alarming is that some used financial support to invest in helping to develop this curriculum. And so a lot of teachers and a lot of those with background in education wonder how much of this financial support was used to push the private industry agenda of what content to be included. So for example, the Gates Foundation funded a lot of the development of these particular standards. So how much were they able to push their own agenda in the content area with them not necessarily having a background in education? So teachers or public school officials were not necessarily involved, and they're not necessarily, the creators were not necessarily representative of a lot of the diversity subgroups. which kind of speaks to what we're talking about here. Many of them were, however, experts in subject fields. You had experts in math, experts in literature, that type of thing, that helped to develop these state standards. So these state standards do again focus on content subjects, so history, math, science, that type of thing. They do not address multiculturalism specifically, and so it's kind of up to the teacher to determine how they're going to pull in multicultural perspectives into this content area. So, a question that we're continuing to ask here through our research is it the content itself that helps or inhibits some diversity subgroups from learning, or is it how we're going about teaching it? So what we have found, and again in the past, is that there is an opportunity gap and an achievement gap between minority students and those that are falling into the mainstream. And so a lot of the minority students are considered at risk for learning. Also, we have found that how students view their status in schools affect how they perform. So if a student is of a certain minority group that is considered at risk, and if they feel like or believe that they are at risk, they're more likely to fail because they already perceive themselves as not being successful. So what we have found in our research thus far is that student underachievement is affected by several things. One is class size. So larger class sizes do attribute to student underachievement. So the smaller the class size, the more likely the students are to be successful despite minority group. Also, underrepresentation in school governance of their personal diversity group does help with cause underachievement. So if a student is, say, per se, an African American student in an all-white school with all-white teachers and all-white principals, they're less likely to, or more likely to have underachievement and less likely to achieve. Also, school financing and resources play a role in student underachievement. Again, the more financing and the more strategic investment in resources, the more likely the students are to achieve. Student underachievement is not affected by certain things, however, that we often associate to perhaps student success. Longer school days has not really shown, there's not significant research showing that longer school days causes students to be more successful. Also, a continuous addition of rigorous graduation standards or putting more qualifiers on students to be able to graduate doesn't necessarily help with their achievement. Also, an increase in standardized testing does not necessarily increase achievement. So again, class size, representation, and school financing are huge factors in attributing to their success. Also, something to take note of in this chapter is that diversity can enhance the learning experience. So in the past, it's been kind of thought that students with certain diverse subgroups that were against the kind of the mainstream characteristics that we look at were considered culturally deprived, and so they were less likely, again, and more likely to be placed at risk. What we have found that that's not necessarily true. Students bring in their own culture, and so they're actually not culturally deprived. They have more culture than the mainstream because they're bringing in all these diverse differences. So instead of education trying to remove these diversities in order for them to learn, we should use these diversities to help them learn. So use their extra language background, use all these ethnic backgrounds, use their experiences to help speak to their new learning. So for example, a case of this is a common practice is to tell parents who are English language learners themselves or are new to English to only speak English to their children. So say that you have a student in your class who's learning English as a second language and their parents are not native English speakers either. The school system may tell the parents to only speak English to their child to kind of help them catch up and learn English. There's a problem in that. One problem is if the parents aren't fluent in English, there's going to be a communication breakdown. If I'm not fluent in English and I'm trying to talk to my child only in English, I'm going to be speaking broken English to my child, which speaks to number three, giving them not a great model of a good language usage. So again, I'm breaking down communication. I'm not giving a good model. And since language fuels relationships, I'm less likely to develop a good relationship with my child because, again, I'm speaking in a language I'm not familiar with. Instead, it's actually better to tell the parent to speak to the child in their native language so that the student has the potential to become bilingual. So, again, speaking to the diversities, helping to the diversities rather than inhibiting them. Now, as we talk about the different diversities here, let's keep in mind that teachers cannot have different expectations because of these diversities. So while we can teach students differently, we can't have them expect them to have a different outcome because of their diversities. So let's look at curriculum, assessment, and instruction, which we'll find out are the big three in education. So the first question is, can the teacher change the curriculum for different learners? So we know students learn differently. We know that they're made up of all these different diverse subgroups. So can we change the curriculum for them? Can we say, you know what, this student is not a native English speaker, so let me just not have them read these complicated books that everybody else is having to read. Or you know what, this student is struggling in math, so let me just make it to where they don't have to learn all those advanced strategies and advanced math principles. I'll just let them learn these simple ones. No, we cannot do that. All students, despite their diversity subgroup, have to follow the state curriculum, which again we just discussed earlier. The only way that they're able to stray from those expectations is if the student has been diagnosed with a disability and has a specialized plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's the only way that the teacher's going to be able to stray from those curricular expectations. So the next question is can the teacher change the assessment for the different learners? And this answer is kind of somewhat. The teacher can alter their own personalized quizzes, tests, projects, that kind of thing to fit the needs of the students. And it's probably a good idea to do that to help the students incrementally increase and to keep them interested in having some level of success. However, oftentimes students are asked to take a state or federal standardized test at the end of the year. You're probably familiar with those. And all the students have to take them, and oftentimes it's based upon the grade level. So all the students, unless they have a specialized plan because of their disability, are going to be asked to take these assessments. So again, they're all going to have the end of the year same expectations. So the last question is, can the teacher change the instructions for different learners? And that answer is yes. For the most part, teachers are allowed to teach however they see need for their students, keeping in mind that in the end they're going to have the same expectations and they're going to have to learn the same curriculum, but how they go about doing it is different. So a way that I kind of summarize it to help people understand is that we're all going to the same place. So we all have the same expectations and we all are learning the same curriculum as students, but how we get there can be different. So the instruction we receive and the learning strategies that we use to teach and learn that lesson and that material can be different based upon our diverse subgroups. So let's move on and talk about diversity in the family structure. So something very interesting to me when reading the text is a statistic that from 1970 to 2013, the number of grandchildren living with their parents the number of grandchildren living with a grandparent-headed household has more than doubled. So that kind of helps me put into perspective the family dynamics in a lot of these diversity subgroups. Also, always kind of keep in mind that parents, for the most part, want their children to be successful in school. So what you want to do as a teacher is to try to get to know the parents, the different diverse subgroups of the parents, and even get to know the neighborhoods of the school. Oftentimes, you may not live in the same neighborhood that you teach. So you can imagine how it feels for a parent to have an outsider, someone they don't know, someone who wasn't raised in their neighborhood subculture, come in and teach their child and not really know a lot about them. So in that way, you kind of have to have that communication channel open for them to learn you and know a lot about you, and for you to know them as people and as a neighborhood and a community. Historically speaking, parents were actually the teachers before we had formalized schooling. As schools have progressed and we've formalized the art of schooling, parents, if you've noticed, have been slowly pushed out. Now teachers serve as what is called a loco parentis, which means in place of the parents during school hours. So for a lot of accountability and mandated reporting, teachers are the parents during the school hours. But interestingly, just the idea of that shows how much we've pushed parents out. So a way that I think of it and a way that you can kind of look at this is that investing in a student is basically investing in their whole family. So what you're trying to do again is to really get in touch with those communities and those neighborhoods to really gain perspective into those diverse subgroups. So here's some particular family structures that you might want to consider and some of those considerations you might want to make. So when you have parents and special needs, what if the parent, him or herself, has special needs? Some things you got to think about is how am I going to explain things to that parent with a special need? How am I going to explain the advanced curriculum, the advanced assessment, how I'm going about helping their child? How am I going to break that down on their level to explain it to a parent with special needs? Also, how do I help them help their child? So you're going to have parents who have special needs, and you may be teaching a student with special needs whose parents also have special needs. So how do you train them, especially if their special need is academic and cognitive based, to help their own child? Now, what if the shoe is on the other foot and you're looking at and trying to work with parents who have students with special needs? Number one, you have to help them learn how to advocate for their own child. And that's something that a lot of parents don't know if they have a student with or have a child with special needs. They may not know what resources to go to learn about that disability or what resources are available in the school system for that student with special needs. Also, how to involve them in the decisions for their child's education. Parents are an integral part of the special education programming that are made available to students with special needs. So they need to know about how to get involved and how to make those decisions. Also, how to help based upon and how to understand that special need in itself, the medical basis of it, the genetic basis of it, what to expect during transitioning when the student graduates high school and goes into college, that kind of thing. When you're working with single parents, which is another diversity subgroup, one thing you want to keep in mind is the arrangement for meetings. If you're a single parent, oftentimes your work schedule or your obligations are different because you're the only parent in the household. So how to arrange for meetings, asking who else is involved. Are there grandparents involved? With single parents, there's more likely to have non-custodial parents involved. Also, little things like getting their name right, because they might not have the same last name as their children, makes a big difference. Also, for low-income parents, again, arranging for specialized meetings. It may be late evening meetings, phone call meetings, text-based meetings, using technology to FaceTime meetings, even meeting on the weekend if you have to, because again, you're working with low-income parents who are more likely to have several jobs rather than just one, and they're less likely to be able to meet with you during 8 to 5 regular hours. Also, with low-income parents, you may want to consider sending home resources like extra workbooks, extra books, extra school supplies to try to fill that gap, and kind of give their child that equal opportunity at education. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the diversity in assessment. So again, we've talked about the big three: curriculum, which is what is taught, the content of what is taught; instruction, which is how to actually go about teaching; and assessment is how we again test and determine if students have met those curricular needs and understand that content based upon the instruction that we've provided. So just like with curriculum instruction, assessment does not have built-in diversity. So as you've read in your text, sometimes assessment items can be biased or non-representative, and that will affect how some subgroups are able to perform. So based upon the assessment, if it is biased or not, some subgroups may have an advantage over other subgroups based upon the context or the language used in the assessment. So your textbook talks about how that is measured. There is something called differential item functioning, which is a statistical analysis that they use on assessment items to help determine if there is any bias. So the process is that students from different subgroups will take the test. So different diversities, different genders, different races, different social classes, even students from different regions of the state or the nation will take the same tests getting the same items. Then they will look at how these subgroups did on the items. If there is a significant difference in the scores among one subgroup in comparison to the others, the test item might be biased. And so what if there's a certain question and all the boys do well on it and all the girls do not? Or all the African American males do well on it but all the other subgroups do not? or all the English language learners really struggle with that one, but the ones that have a basis in English do not. Or those that are considered in the poverty level of social class don't score well, but all the others do. Or those that live in rural environments get it wrong, but those who live in urban environments do not. They look at all these subgroups and determine if there is a bias. And this is especially important when you're testing across regions and other states, because we have had test items come across where it asks students about taking public transit. Well, in rural areas, we don't have public transit. We don't have a MARTA. We barely have an Uber. We don't have a lot of these public transit. We either drive our own cars, we walk, we ride bikes, but there's not a public transit. So a question relating to public transit would confuse those in southern or rural regions, and they might score because they don't understand the context or the language, not because they don't understand the content per se itself. So again, that's a way that assessments are not necessarily bias free. So lastly, the text talks about ways to engage students of all diversities and despite diversity subgroup. One thing is just to keep it real and to give real world examples and engage them with real world knowledge. So get to know what students of that age level like, what they understand, what they are exposed to in their real world settings. And again, knowing that neighborhood knowledge and knowing the community knowledge will help you. Also developing authentic assessments, letting them write, develop, and create to show what they know rather than picking from a multiple choice item, which is more likely to have a bias. If you let them create their own knowledge, they're more likely to be able to explain to you in their own words what they know rather than pick the right answer. Also make sure that it's relevant to them. Help them see how this is going to be important to them in their future. Also, choice always helps, giving them a choice. So maybe you have, again, you can't choose your curriculum, it's set, but maybe you have a different group of activities that they can do that will get you to the same expectation, get you to the same assessment, but let them choose which way they want to go about showing you. That will also give them ownership. So again, those are just a couple of ways and a couple of things related to school reform, which is a continued conversation related to multicultural education, as well as family support and communication, and how we address bias in assessment for multicultural education.